The air hung heavy and humid, a stifling blanket typical of the late summer in the Ozarks, Missouri, 1894. It was a humidity that seemed to press not just on the skin, but on the very soul. Elias Thorne wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, the action doing little to ease the creeping chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He stood before the imposing, decaying structure known locally as the Ashworth Estate. Elias was a man of logic, a pragmatic lawyer from St. Louis, weary from the arduous journey by train and carriage. He was not prone to fancy, yet the Ashworth mansion, or the Macabre mansion, as the locals whispered, was a monument to profound, unsettling quiet. It wasn't the silence of vacancy, but a silence that felt held, as if the very walls were clenching a terrible secret. The oppressive heat of the late August day only amplified the sense of stagnation. Nothing here had moved or breathed freely for decades. He'd inherited the property from his distant relative, Mrs. Lenore Ashworth, a woman he had never met, whose passing had been as unremarkable to the outside world as her life had apparently been isolated. The deed had arrived in St. Louis alongside a terse letter from a local notary, hinting at the difficulties of liquidating the estate due to its remote location and unusual history. The townspeople Elias had encountered seemed to regard the place with a peculiar blend of fear and pity, their eyes shifting away whenever the name Ashworth was mentioned. The house itself was Gothic revival, at its most ambitious and neglected. Dark, heavy stone, windows like vacant eyes under severe gabled brows, and a veranda of peeling paint that looked like shredded skin. A twisted ancient oak, said to have been struck by lightning decades prior, dominated the overgrown yard, its skeletal branches casting deep, erratic shadows even in the midday sun. The surrounding forest, dense and unforgiving, pressed in on all sides, isolating the mansion from any semblance of civilization. Elias pushed open the heavy front door. It didn't creak dramatically, but offered a deep, resonant thud that echoed in the cavernous entryway, vibrating up through the soles of his boots. The air inside was immediately thick with the scent of dust, dried rose petals, a powerful, cloying perfume, and a faint, metallic tang Elias couldn't place. The world beyond the threshold was instantly muted. The oppressive sunlight replaced by a perpetual twilight, filtered through drawn, heavy velvet curtains that seemed to absorb all sound. "Mr. Thorne?" Elias started, spinning around to see a woman emerging from the gloom of the adjacent drawing room. She was thin, dressed in the severe, faded black of mourning, her silhouette seeming to dissolve into the shadows. Her face was a map of deep-set exhaustion, lined with something that looked more like chronic fear than age. This was Martha, the Ashworth's former housekeeper. "Yes, I am Elias Thorne. You must be Martha," Elias said, extending his hand. Her handshake was frail and cold, yet her grip was surprisingly firm, almost desperate, clinging to him like a lifeline. He felt the nervous tremor running through her arm. "I stayed to await your arrival, sir. To explain things," Martha whispered, her voice a dry, strained whisper, betraying a fear that seemed to have settled permanently in her throat, a physical manifestation of years spent in this house. "Explain what, Martha? The inventory? The sale?" Elias tried to keep his tone businesslike, but the sheer atmosphere of the place made it difficult. Martha shook her head slowly, her gaze darting nervously to the grand, dark staircase and then back to Elias, as if she expected something to descend. "The silence, Mr. Thorne. It was always the silence. Lenore and her son, Julian. After her husband died, after that night, it was as if they vanished from the world, yet they were always here, breathing the same air, sharing the same secret. Her son?" Elias frowned, reviewing the few mental documents he had pulled from his case files. The will only mentioned Mrs. Ashworth and the estate passing to the nearest living relative, which is myself. I was under the impression she was widowed and childless. Martha's eyes widened momentarily, reflecting the faint light from the window, then narrowed with a terrible, knowing sadness. Julian. He was 28, sir, but he hadn't left the house since he turned 21. His father, Mr. Thomas Ashworth, passed away when Julian was a boy, barely 12. But it was after that, sir. Things changed. Lenore. She held on to him, fiercely, as if he was all she had and more than any husband could ever be. Elias felt a prickle of professional detached unease begin to merge with a more visceral discomfort. More than a son, Martha. Martha stepped closer, her shadow engulfing his, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, a voice used to keeping decades of secrets. They said in town, sir. They wouldn't say it loud, mind you, but they saw the way she looked at him, the way she controlled him, the way she dressed him in suits that matched her own elaborate style, even in the gardens. They had their own customs here, sir, their own closed world. He was her heir, her confidant, her companion, her everything, and she made sure he remained that way, psychologically binding him to this mansion until he was no longer a man, but an extension of her will. The air suddenly felt colder, despite the heat outside. Elias, the man of logic, was struggling to rationalize the emotional intensity in Martha's confession. Where is Julian now, Martha? Was he here when Lenore passed? He was, sir, right here in this house, but he is gone now, vanished, since the morning they found her. The doctor, Sheriff Peterson, they confirmed only Lenore's passing peacefully in her bed. Julian, he just isn't here, and he didn't take so much as a change of clothes. Martha wrung her hands, the fabric of her apron twisting. I saw him the night before she died. He looked pale, thinner than ever. He kept staring at the wedding portrait in the main hall, not at his father, sir, but at the empty space beside his mother in the frame. He just kept touching the glass. Elias looked around the dimly lit hall, his gaze falling upon a massive oil painting over the mantelpiece. It depicted Lenore Ashworth in a stunning, severe wedding gown, her face a mask of elegant, predatory self-possession. Next to her, Thomas Ashworth, a man with a gentle, if slightly defeated, expression. But Martha's words suddenly pierced through the gloom. He kept touching the glass, at the empty space beside his mother in the frame. Elias moved toward the portrait, pulling a small, flickering oil lamp from a side table to better illuminate the canvas. The light cut through the gloom. Martha had described a couple. What he saw was a single figure. It was not the Ashworth wedding portrait. It was a painting of a solitary Lenore, young and radiant, standing alone in her gown against a dark background. Martha, Elias said slowly, turning back to the terrified woman, his legal mind reeling at the implication of such a monumental change. This is not a wedding portrait. This is a portrait of Mrs. Ashworth alone. Where is the one with her husband, the one Julian was touching? Martha's eyes were wide again, reflecting the flickering lamplight, her terror suddenly escalating from dread to panic. It was always there, sir. Always. The two of them. It was the only painting in the main hall. They were side by side, just as they should be. He was touching it just last week. I saw him. A sudden sharp draft snaked through the hall, a breath of cold air in the heavy humidity, extinguishing the fragile lamp. Darkness enveloped them, thick and absolute, save for a faint square of light from a window far down the hall. The silence returned, but this time it was a profound, watchful stillness, a silence that demanded attention. Elias felt the undeniable sensation of being observed. Something in this house was not merely dust and decay. It was a carefully constructed, deeply unsettling mystery, a testament to a human drama that had gone terribly, horrifyingly wrong. The painting, the visual centerpiece of the home, had been altered or swapped, meaning someone had gone to great, meticulous lengths to erase the memory of the husband. Mr. Thorne. Martha's voice was a barely audible tremor in the darkness. You shouldn't stay here. Whatever happened to Julian? It started with Lenore's possessiveness, and it ended with a secret this house won't let go of. The house is waiting for him to come back. Elias reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving a box of matches. As he struck one, the brief, sulphurous flash revealed Martha's face contorted in a silent, horrified gasp. She was staring not at Elias, but over his shoulder, toward the dark, empty archway leading to the dining room. The match went out, plunging them back into the ink. "Martha, what is it?" Elias's own voice was now barely above a whisper. "The air," she whimpered, backing away towards the entrance. "The air around the master bedroom window on the second floor. It's been open, sir, just a crack. But it wasn't open when she died. I made sure it was sealed after the doctor left." The chilling implication was clear. Someone had been in the house very recently after the official sealing of the room, and that person, likely Julian, was the living key to a terrifying narrative of twisted love, smothered identity, and a profound, pathological control. If you want to uncover the dark secret of the Ashworth estate and find out what really happened to Julian, be sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Don't miss the next chapter of The Macabre Mansion. Elias Thorne relit the lamp, his hand steady despite the chilling revelation. Martha's terror was infectious, but his lawyer's instinct, the need to categorize and verify, was stronger. He needed facts, not phantoms. "Martha, I need to see Julian's room," Elias stated, his voice regaining its professional steel. If he packed nothing, there must be something left behind. A note, a journal, an explanation for his vanishing act. Martha protested weakly, clinging to the shadows of the main hall. "Sir, you shouldn't. That room. It was always hers, in a way, even when he occupied it. It was where she kept him safe from the world, and safe for herself." Ignoring her plea, Elias ascended the grand staircase. The heavy oak treads groaned under his weight, each step a pronounced punctuation mark in the mansion's vast silence. The oppressive darkness of the first floor gave way to a second-floor landing slightly brighter, illuminated by a tall, narrow window. Julian's room was at the end of the long corridor, adjacent to the master suite, Lenore's room. The location itself spoke volumes of the mother's need for proximity and surveillance. Elias found the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open, raising the lamp. The room was not the typical chamber of a man, even one from 1894. It was sterile, almost monastic. The furniture was heavy, dark mahogany, antique, and perfectly preserved, but it lacked any personal clutter. No books, save for a single leather-bound volume on a bedside table. No photographs, no scattered clothing. It was a museum exhibit of a young man's life, perfectly ordered, but devoid of soul. The only touch of color came from the rich, deep purple of the velvet draperies and the thick bedspread. Lenore's favorite color, Elias recalled Martha mentioning earlier. Elias walked slowly to the large four-poster bed. The sheets were neatly turned down, as if Julian expected to return any moment. The stillness here was sharper, more profound than in the rest of the house. It felt less like a bedroom and more like a carefully constructed gilded cage. He picked up the leather-bound book from the bedside table. It was not a novel or a book of poetry. It was Julian's personal journal. The paper was thin, the ink faded in places, suggesting years of use. Elias sat on the edge of the bed and opened it to the last page. The handwriting was elegant, almost feminine, yet trembling. July 23, 1894. The fever is gone now. The physician visits daily only to attend to her. My presence is an assumption. She does not look at me anymore, not with the fire she used to hold. I am merely the reflection in her glass, a perfectly polished memory. It is the only way she can endure the passing of Thomas. She told me again tonight, the same words she has used since I was 12. "You are the finest part of him, Julian. You are the second chance. You are the keeper of the Ashworth silence." Elias flipped back a few pages, his eyes scanning the tortured entries. June 10th, 1893. I dared to mention the possibility of a trip to St. Louis, a university lecture. The reaction was immediate, brutal, though she never raised her voice. The coldness was worse than any shout. She spoke of the responsibility, the sacred duty I hold to this house, to her. A man leaves his home when he finds a greater purpose. She whispered, stroking my hair. What purpose could be greater than being my only comfort? I retracted my request immediately. The guilt is a collar of iron. The entries painted a chilling portrait of psychological domination. Lenore had not just been a demanding mother. She had been a sculptor of her son's reality, systematically eliminating any external influence, friends, education, romantic interest, to ensure his identity was solely defined by his role as her companion. The husband element, Elias realized, was not necessarily a physical act, but an intense emotional substitution, far more insidious and binding. He returned to the bedside table. There was a small, locked mahogany box tucked into the drawer. Elias ran his fingers over the intricate brass inlay. It was a personal safe, likely containing the only items Julian considered truly his own. Elias noted the lack of a key, filed the information for later, and then turned his attention to the windows. The master bedroom window, the one Martha mentioned, was just a few feet away in the adjoining suite. Julian's own window, however, was sealed tight, the heavy velvet drapes muffling the faint sounds of the afternoon. Elias pulled them aside. The glass was immaculate, but he noticed a small, distinct abrasion on the wooden sill, as if something heavy had been repeatedly rubbed against it. Elias moved to the master suite door, which was secured with a sturdy latch. He produced a set of lock-picking tools from his lawyer's case, a necessary skill for property claims in the Ozarks, and worked the lock with practiced hands. The click was sharp in the dead air. He stepped into Lenore Ashworth's chamber of state. The master bedroom was the antithesis of Julian's. It was lavish, suffocatingly so. Every surface was draped in silk, lace, or velvet. The air was overwhelmingly saturated with the scent of dried roses, so potent it bordered on putrefaction. The immense bed, still perfectly made, dominated the room. But it was the small detail that drew Elias's eye to the window. It was indeed slightly ajar, just a half-inch crack. He crossed the room, pulling a handkerchief over his nose to filter the cloying floral scent. Looking out, he saw only the dense, dark woods. But then his eyes dropped to the floor directly beneath the window. There, almost hidden beneath the edge of the thick rug, was a small, rectangular photograph, face down. Elias picked it up. It was an old daguerreotype, faded, but clearly recognizable. It was Julian, perhaps 20 years old, dressed in a black suit identical to the one in the family portrait he had seen. But he was not alone. Standing beside him was Lenore, her arm looped tightly through his. Julian's face was utterly blank, his eyes vacant. The most disturbing detail was the placement of their hands. Lenore's left hand, adorned with her wedding ring, rested possessively on Julian's right, which also appeared to be wearing a plain gold band, clearly visible even in the faded image. The photograph, the visual record of the mother and keeper, confirmed the terrifying gossip. Lenore had not only controlled her son's life, she had completed the act of substitution, elevating him to the role of a replacement husband, legally or psychologically. This was the dark core of the Ozarks' silence. As Elias pocketed the damning evidence, he noticed something else. A tiny, faint stain on the polished hardwood floor near the bedside table. A dark, almost black smear that seemed to have been scrubbed repeatedly. It was barely visible, but Elias's eyes, trained to find hidden facts, caught the unnatural coloration. It was a fresh, unsettling detail that added a physical dimension to the psychological horror. Julian's vanishing act was more than just an escape. It was possibly the result of a violent, final confrontation, the ultimate breaking of the iron collar. The oppressive heat of the Ashworth mansion, charged with old guilt and secrets, was briefly replaced by the sticky, humid heat of the town of Black Creek, a dusty, worn settlement a few miles away. Elias Thorne needed context, a narrative counterpoint to Martha's whispered dread and Julian's tortured journal. He drove the hired carriage into the center of Black Creek. The town was typical of the isolated Ozark communities, a general store doubling as the post office, a small, severe-looking church, and a tavern whose dusty windows offered little in the way of welcome. The townsfolk were hardened, suspicious, their expressions immediately closing off upon seeing the immaculate attire of a stranger from the city. Elias went directly to the sheriff's office, a small clapboard structure attached to the jail. Sheriff Peterson was a man carved from the regional granite, slow-moving, heavy-set, and possessed of eyes that saw everything but registered nothing overtly. He sat tilted back in a wooden chair, feet up on a desk cluttered with dusty ledgers. "Mr. Thorne, the lawyer from St. Louis," the sheriff rumbled, not bothering to lower his feet. "Heard you arrived at the Ashworth place. Quiet business? Lenore's passing. Heart trouble." "It may be quiet legally, Sheriff, but I have concerns," Elias began, setting his briefcase on the desk. "The housekeeper, Martha, tells me that Mrs. Ashworth's son, Julian, vanished the morning after her passing. He took nothing. I also found evidence that someone has been in the master suite since it was sealed." Sheriff Peterson slowly lowered his chair legs, the scrape of wood against wood loud in the small room. He looked at Elias with an expression of weary finality. "Julian Ashworth is a grown man, Mr. Thorne. 28. He may have finally decided to see the world. As for the window, it's an old house. Things shift. Critters." "Critters don't wear wedding rings, Sheriff," Elias countered, pulling out the daguerreotype he found under the rug. He slid it across the desk. Julian was wearing this or something like it. This photo, along with his journal, details a profound psychological entanglement that was deeply disturbing. The town knew. "You must have known." The sheriff picked up the photo, studied it for a long moment, and sighed heavily, the sound of a man tired of maintaining a collective fiction. "The Ozarks holds its own customs, Mr. Thorne, and its own silence. Lenore Ashworth was a powerful woman. She owned the land and the mortgages on half the businesses in this county. She was singular in her affections." He tapped the photo with a thick finger. "The truth is, Lenore lost her first husband, Thomas, to a bad fever 12 years ago. She lost her mind not long after. Julian was a sickly boy, easy to mold. She convinced herself, and eventually him, that he needed to step into Thomas's shoes, not just as the man of the house, but the companion. Did she legally marry him? No, sir. She was too clever for that. She kept the legal fiction of her widowhood, but she held a private ceremony in the drawing room on his 21st birthday. The town knew of it. We all simply agreed not to see it. Julian was the keeper. That's what she called him. That's what we called him. It's sad, but it's not a crime." The sheriff handed the photo back. "Until a crime is committed, Julian Ashworth is a missing person who finally broke free of his mother's chain." Elias realized he was dealing with a deeply ingrained cultural and economic complicity. The town had allowed Lenore's madness to flourish for its own quiet convenience. "And what about the stain on the floor of her room?" Elias pressed, detailing the small, dark smear he'd found. The sheriff paused, leaning forward slightly, a flicker of genuine concern finally crossing his face. "Lenore passed peacefully in her bed, Mr. Thorne. If there's a stain, it's from a cut finger or something she spilled. I had Doc Healy up there, and I personally sealed the door after the undertaker left. If Julian came back, he's just proving my point. He's running." Elias left the office with a feeling of profound frustration. The town's silence was not merely ignorance, it was active repression, built on fear and economic dependence. He decided to visit the only other person mentioned in the minimal estate notes, Dr. Healy, Lenore's longtime physician. Dr. Healy's house was small, tidy and smelled strongly of carbolic acid and stale tobacco. The doctor, a small, jumpy man with tired eyes, seemed instantly agitated by Elias's presence. Lenore died of heart failure, natural causes. End of the matter, Dr. Healy declared before Elias could speak, wiping his hands nervously on a towel. I'm interested in Julian, Elias stated, cutting to the point. Was he present during her final hours? What was his state of mind? Dr. Healy looked away, fiddling with a dusty microscope on his desk. Julian, he was always withdrawn. Lenore kept him weak, Mr. Thorne, emotionally frail. She kept him on a regime of tonics and potions that were mostly placebo. She told him he was sickly, weak, entirely dependent on her care, on her keeping. Did you ever examine Julian, Dr. Healy? Only when Lenore was present. She wouldn't allow me a private moment. She needed to reinforce the narrative of his dependency. But, Mr. Thorne, the doctor leaned in, lowering his voice until it was nearly a gasp. The night Lenore died, Julian came to me, around midnight. He was shaking, drenched in sweat. He was holding something small and dark in his hand, but he wouldn't show me. He kept repeating, "She's done it. She finally did it." He didn't mean she had died. He meant something else. Elias felt a cold current run down his spine. What did he mean, doctor? I don't know. He didn't make sense. He was on the verge of a complete breakdown. He was talking about the masterpiece being finished. He ran out before I could give him a sedative. I went up the next morning, found Lenore passed. I gave her heart failure. It was the easiest, safest diagnosis for everyone, including Julian, who I hoped had finally fled for good. Elias knew the sheriff was complicit in this lie of convenience. Julian hadn't fled peacefully. He'd been driven to the brink. Elias's eyes fell upon a heavy tome on the doctor's shelf, a manual on toxicology. "Dr. Healy," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "What kind of masterpiece would involve a dark stain on the floor and a son whispering about a feverish completion?" The doctor paled, suddenly looking terrified. "I have no idea. I have said too much. Get out, Mr. Thorne. Go back to St. Louis. Leave the Ashworth secret buried with Lenore." Elias understood now. The mystery wasn't just about a missing man. It was about the cause of Lenore's death and what Julian meant by "she's done it." The psychological terror Julian had endured must have led to a final desperate act, an act the town was willing to cover up, to finally be rid of Lenore's oppressive influence. Elias had to find the masterpiece and Julian before the Ozarks silence swallowed them both. Back in the stale, echoing drawing room of the Macabre mansion, Elias Thorne spread the few legal documents he had procured from the notary in St. Louis and the papers retrieved from Lenore's locked bureau. He dismissed Martha for the evening, her anxiety a distracting hum in the background. His lawyer's mind latched onto the one stable anchor in the sea of psychological chaos: the law. If Lenore had successfully substituted Julian for her deceased husband, she must have established an absolute legal control over him before he reached maturity. Elias focused on the estate of Thomas Ashworth, Lenore's actual husband, who had died 12 years prior. The official record noted death by fever. The will, dated 2 years before Thomas's death, was clear. "Upon my passing, all estate holdings are to pass to my wife, Lenore Ashworth, until our son, Julian Ashworth, reaches the age of 25 years, at which time the entirety of the Ashworth estate shall revert to his sole ownership." The loophole was glaring, but only visible now in the context of Lenore's monstrous ambition. Julian had vanished at the age of 28, 3 years after he should have legally inherited everything. Elias pulled up the parish records, the few the notary had provided, and cross-referenced the dates. Thomas Ashworth's death, August 12th, 1882. Julian's 25th birthday, May 3rd, 1891. Lenore had been in sole control for 8 years, but on May 3rd, 1891, The house, the money, the land, all of it should have been Julian's. Why didn't the transfer happen? Elias muttered aloud, pacing the length of the dusty Turkish rug. Lenore was known for her meticulous attention to detail. She would never have forgotten this date, but she would certainly have found a way to circumvent it. He returned to the documents, searching for any codicil, any legal instrument dated between 1882 and 1891. He found it, tucked into a sealed envelope labeled Private Re Julian's Health. It was a notarized affidavit dated April 1, 1891, just weeks before Julian's inheritance date. The document was an affidavit signed by Dr. Healy and 2 other local men, testifying that Julian Ashworth suffered from chronic debilitating melancholia and acute hysterical dependency, rendering him legally incompetent to manage his vast inheritance. The document stipulated that Lenore Ashworth would remain the sole executrix and trustee of the estate until such time as Julian was deemed capable, a condition Julian's mother ensured would never be met by maintaining her regime of isolating dependency. It was a perfectly legal, meticulously planned act of psychological and financial entrapment. Lenore had not just emotionally controlled her son, she had used the law to steal his future, cementing his role as the permanent, dependent keeper. Elias felt a deep, cold fury. This was the horror, not a ghost story, but the cold, calculating cruelty of a mother who had leveraged her son's grief and love into a life sentence of obedience, all for the sake of holding on to her prestige and controlling the only man she believed she could ever truly own. He packed the affidavit, knowing this was the leverage he needed over the sheriff and Dr. Healy. But the document still didn't explain the missing wedding portrait or the dark stain. Elias decided to investigate the small, locked mahogany box he'd found in Julian's room. It was now clear that this box likely held the final private resistance of Julian Ashworth. He fetched a sturdy, slim knife from his luggage, and after several tense minutes managed to pry open the box, the dry wood splintering slightly under the pressure. Inside, Elias found 3 things. 1. A bundle of letters, written by Julian to a woman named Eliza. They were penned between his 18th and 20th birthdays, passionate and desperate, speaking of leaving the Ozarks, starting a life, and escaping the velvet prison. They all went unanswered. 2. A single tarnished silver key. It was intricately carved and looked like it belonged to a small private chest or a piece of furniture. 3. A sketch pad. Its cover was worn and water-stained. Elias opened the sketch pad. It wasn't filled with landscapes or portraits. It was filled entirely with drawings of Lenore's wedding portrait, the one with Thomas. But with each sketch, the original husband was slowly being erased, replaced by Julian. The progression was disturbing. First, Thomas's face was blurred. Then his suit was redrawn to mirror Julian's. Finally, in the last sketches, Thomas was gone entirely, replaced by a perfect rendering of Julian standing in the husband's exact pose, his face finally showing a flicker of proud, albeit forced, expression. The physical act of erasing the father and inserting the son, first in the drawing, then in the mind, and then physically replacing the painting in the hall, was the masterpiece of Lenore's psychological control. She had literally rewritten history within the walls of her home. The wedding portrait had not been swapped. The original had likely been altered by Julian himself under the subtle, relentless direction of his mother. Elias realized that Julian had not only suffered her emotional tyranny, he had become her active accomplice in the delusion. The son had married the mother's idea of him. The weight of this compliance must have been crushing. Elias flipped the page one last time. The final drawing was not of the portrait. It was a careful, meticulous diagram of the master suite, specifically the wall behind Lenore's bed, and marked with a single, cryptic note. The repository. She guarded it with her sleep. Elias pocketed the silver key and the diagram. Lenore's masterpiece was more than just the revised portrait. It was a physical secret, A repository that she had kept sealed while alive, perhaps containing the truth about Thomas's fever, or perhaps the final desperate measures she took to keep Julian permanently broken. The silver key, now warm in his hand, was almost certainly the key to the repository. Julian hadn't fled empty-handed after all. He had left the keys to the entire nightmare for Elias to find. The atmosphere in the house, already thick with history, now felt electrified with the near certainty of Thomas Ashworth's murder and Lenore's monstrous manipulation. Elias, armed with the legal affidavit and Julian's cryptic diagram, sought out Martha in the dusty, cavernous kitchen where she was nervously preparing a meager supper. "Martha, you must be honest with me, completely," Elias said, placing the affidavit of incompetence on the worn butcher block. Julian should have inherited this house in 1891, but Lenore had him declared incompetent. She trapped him, legally and emotionally. "I know you saw the transition. I need to know about Thomas Ashworth's death. Was it really a fever?" Martha froze, her knife clattering onto the floor. Her face, usually pale, flushed with a deep, sickly red. She gripped the edge of the counter, fighting to control a sudden violent shudder. "Oh, Lord, sir, I prayed this would stay buried," she choked out, tears finally breaking through her barrier of controlled dread. "You saw the look in that boy's eyes. You saw the silence she built around him. She was a beautiful woman, Mr. Thorne, but she was a predator. And Thomas was weak. He wanted to leave." Martha wiped her face with the back of her hand, her voice dropping back to a rapid, terrified whisper. Thomas wanted to take Julian away. To St. Louis, a boarding school, away from this oppressive valley. He'd made plans in the summer of '82. He tried to hire a new solicitor, a new physician. He was fighting her. "The fever," Elias prompted, his voice gentle but firm. "What was the fever, Martha?" "It was no fever, sir. Not the way the good Lord sends it." Martha looked wildly around the kitchen, ensuring no ear was listening. Lenore was studying, always studying. She had a little shed out back for her gardening, she said, but she was grinding things, mixing things. And Dr. Healy, he was fresh out of medical school, desperate for Lenore's patronage. She had him convinced Thomas was drinking, unstable. "Did she poison him?" Martha nodded, a convulsive movement. Slowly, a little tincture in his tea, a special tonic for his nerves. Something that mimicked the fever, the delirium. But the end. The final night was the worst. Julian. He was 12. He was watching. The horror intensified, shifting from psychological control to calculated murder. Elias felt the true weight of the masterpiece now. The elimination of the husband, the appropriation of the son, and the rewriting of history, all done in silence. What did Julian see, Martha? He saw her standing over the bed, holding Thomas's hand, comforting him. But she wasn't comforting him, sir. She was finishing it. She was holding a small, silver locket, the one Thomas gave her when Julian was born. She pressed it into Thomas's palm and then kissed Julian on the forehead, right there, watching his father die, and she told him, "This locket holds the secret to my strength, Julian, and now you, my sweet boy, must keep me strong. You are now the keeper of all that matters." "A symbolic transfer," Elias murmured, understanding the ritualistic cruelty. The moment she bound Julian to her crime. Yes, she didn't need to physically threaten him, sir. She used the guilt, the horror, the secret. She made him complicit in his father's death, and thus forever dependent on her silence. That was the start of the keeper role. She gave him the locket, and then she burned all Thomas's papers that night. "The silver key I found," Elias said, pulling it out. "It's tarnished, but it looks like a locket key." Martha's eyes fastened on the key. "That's it, sir. The key to the locket. Julian must have kept it. He never let the locket out of his sight. It was the only tangible thing he had from that night, the symbol of his bond and his horror. But if he has the locket, Why did he leave the key? Elias looked at the diagram of the master suite he had found in Julian's box. Because the locket is not in his possession, Martha. I believe the locket is the final piece of the masterpiece. The physical proof of her crime stored in a hidden location. And Julian, driven mad by his mother's final act, may have put the key where someone else could find it and uncover the truth. The diagram you hold, sir, Martha whispered, pointing a shaking finger. What does it show? It shows the wall behind Lenore's bed. It calls the location the repository. I believe Julian, knowing his mother was near death, finally found his courage. He may have used his knowledge of the house, his role as the keeper, to access this hiding place one last time, perhaps to place or retrieve something. Elias rose, his determination solidifying. The stain on the floor, the open window, Julian's breakdown. It all pointed to a final confrontation. Martha, I need you to leave. Now. Go to a neighbor, the church, anywhere. If Julian is still in the woods, he may return here to destroy whatever is left. If he finds me, he may see me as another agent of his mother's control. Julian wouldn't hurt anyone, sir. He's too broken, Martha pleaded. A broken man who witnessed murder, was psychologically tormented, and had his entire life stolen is capable of anything, Martha. Especially if he believes the final truth is still locked away. Go. Martha fled, her shadow disappearing out the back door. Elias, now alone in the menacing silence of the mansion, carried the lamp, the diagram, and the silver key up to the master suite. He had a murder to confirm, and a madman to find. The repository was the key to both. The master bedroom felt different this time. Without Martha's presence, the quiet was heavier, infused with the scent of decay that seemed to emanate from the very linens on the bed. Elias Thorne closed the door, locking it, and pulled the oil lamp closer to the wall behind the four-poster bed. The bed itself was enormous, draped in heavy, dark fabric that muffled sound. Julian's diagram was a simple cross-section, marking a spot precisely 3 feet above the headboard, concealed by a heavy velvet wall hanging. Elias climbed onto the mattress. The heavy velvet was affixed to the wall with small brass tacks. He gently peeled back the fabric at the designated spot. Beneath it, the wallpaper was intact. But upon closer inspection, Elias noticed a faint seam, perfectly aligned with the dark floral pattern. It was a secret panel, expertly disguised. The silver key Julian had left behind was meant not for the small box, but for the lock that held the house's deepest secret. Elias searched the seam until he found a tiny, almost invisible keyhole, hidden within the relief of a sculpted plaster medallion. His hand shook slightly as he inserted the silver key. It turned with a crisp, dry click that resonated through the room. He pulled the panel open. It revealed a small, shallow recess carved into the stone of the thick mansion wall. The repository. Inside there were 2 items. 1. A small, tarnished silver locket. It was heavy and intricately engraved. 2. A bound ledger, stamped with the date 1882. Elias first reached for the locket. It was the item of power, the symbol Julian's mother had used to bind him to her crime. He ran his thumb over the cold metal. He knew the locket would contain the final physical proof of Lenore's crime, likely a confession or a vial of the poison used to kill Thomas. Instead of opening it, Elias set the locket aside and picked up the ledger. The leather was brittle. This was Lenore's personal journal from the year Thomas died. This was the masterpiece in its raw, written form, the record of her descent into madness and control. Elias opened the ledger to the final entry, dated 2 days before Thomas's death. The handwriting was elegant, florid, and terrifyingly lucid. August 10th, 1882. The time is near. Thomas is planning his escape, taking Julian. He thinks he can steal my son, my only chance at a life redeemed. He does not understand that Julian is not merely his heir. Julian is the perfect sculpture, the husband Thomas could never be, obedient, pure, and forever mine. The tonic has done its work. Dr. Healy, poor fool, believes it the final stage of the fever. He will sign the papers I need. August 12th, 1882. Evening. It is done. Thomas fought the last tonic, but Julian's small, steady hand helped hold the cup. My beautiful boy. He watched horrified as his father turned cold, and in that moment the final lesson was learned. Julian and I share a terrible, beautiful secret. I presented him with the locket, Thomas's final gift to me, now the symbol of my strength. I told Julian that the locket holds the secret to our freedom, and that he is the only one worthy to guard it. He cried, but he accepted the key. He accepted his role. The masterpiece is complete. Julian is now the keeper. I shall live forever, reflected in his eyes. The entry confirmed Martha's confession. Lenore had orchestrated Thomas's murder and used the horror of that moment to psychologically shackle her 12-year-old son. Elias flipped the ledger, searching for any entries after Thomas's death. There were none. The journal abruptly ended, the pages blank, as if Lenore's history had stopped the moment her masterpiece was created. Elias now opened the silver locket. It was not a storage vessel. It held two small oval daguerreotypes. On the left side, a picture of a young, handsome man, not Thomas. On the right side, a small, dark curl of hair, wrapped in silk. The man in the photograph was not Thomas Ashworth. He was clearly younger, with a harder, more passionate expression. Elias suddenly understood the true, terrifying depth of Lenore's madness. Lenore had not replaced Thomas with Julian. She had replaced her first love with Thomas, and then replaced Thomas with Julian. Elias returned to the box of estate papers and pulled out Thomas Ashworth's marriage certificate. The date of marriage was 1870, but if Julian was 28, born in 1866, Thomas was not his biological father. Elias realized the true, final secret. Julian was the son of the man in the locket, a forgotten lover, perhaps a man Lenore truly loved and lost. When that man was gone, she married the weak Thomas to give her son a name and a fortune. But when Thomas threatened to take her son away, Lenore killed him, not to protect the estate, but to keep the living replica of her first love, Julian. Julian was not the substitute husband, he was the resurrected love object. The horror was complete. A triple layer of emotional substitution and murder, orchestrated over decades. Elias closed the locket, his hand shaking. This evidence was irrefutable, but the locket did not explain the dark stain on the floor, the open window, or Julian's vanishing. He ran his hand along the bottom edge of the repository recess. His fingers brushed against something rough, tucked into the very back corner. A rolled piece of paper, placed there recently, after Lenore's death. Elias unrolled the paper. It was a single sheet, hastily ripped from Julian's journal, its edges jagged. It was Julian's final, coherent entry, dated the day of his mother's death, August 25th, 1894. She is cold. The masterpiece is complete, not her, but me. I finally saw the locket. The truth is not about the fever, it is about the first love. She killed Thomas for the man in the locket, and then she made me become him. I am not Julian. I am his ghost, trapped in a suit I hate. I finally saw the repository tonight. She left it open. Not for me, but for the one who would clean up. I know what I must do. I am no longer the keeper. I am the avenger. The final act of love and terror is complete. The shame must be cleansed. The stain is real. The true secret is that she was not killed by a fever. I am the final keeper of the house's silence. The locket goes with me. The key stays here for the man who will find the ledger. The house must be sealed for good. The paper ended there, but on the bottom corner, a small, intricate symbol was drawn. A circle with a single vertical line through it, drawn heavily. It was the symbol of the nearby old stone well, notorious in the area for its immense depth and association with local folk tales of misfortune. Julian hadn't just fled. He had executed the final phase of his twisted duty. He had killed his mother, cleansing the shame he felt he embodied, and had disposed of the ultimate evidence, the locket that proved his true parentage and Lenore's ultimate cruelty, in the deepest, most inaccessible place he knew. The chilling reality of Julian's final, calculated act hit Elias Thorne with the force of a physical blow. The missing son was not a victim who fled, but a broken man who had avenged his father's murder and his own stolen life. The masterpiece was not Lenore's, but Julian's. Elias examined the dark stain on the floor again. It was the proof of the crime. Lenore's blood. Julian, in his final moment of clarity and madness, had used the method his mother had taught him: silence and misdirection. He had cleaned the crime scene just well enough, left the window ajar to suggest a fleeing thief, and then vanished, leaving the only irrefutable evidence, the ledger, the affidavit, and the key, behind for Elias, the outside legal mind, to find. The key to Julian's location was the small symbol on his final note: the old stone well. Elias grabbed the lamp, his walking stick, and his legal case containing the ledger and the affidavit. He left the master suite, locking the repository and the door. He had to assume Julian was still nearby, having finished his act, but perhaps not his own life. The old stone well was located in the deepest, most shadowed part of the Ashworth property, far from the manicured gardens where the twisted oak tree met the encroaching forest. The evening air was falling quickly, the twilight of the Ozarks bringing with it a sudden heavy chill that cut through the humid air. Elias followed a barely discernible path, the smell of damp earth and thick undergrowth replacing the mansion's perfumed decay. After a tense 10-minute walk, he found it. A circle of ancient moss-covered stones, about 4 feet high, surrounding a dark, fathomless aperture. No protective wall, no rope, just the stone circle and the vertical line of the immense drop plunging into the blackness. He set the lamp down on the stone coping. The flickering light barely pierced the void below. The silence here was absolute, even deeper than the house's. It was the silence of finality. Elias walked slowly around the wellhead, his eyes sweeping the ground for any sign of disturbance. Near the edge, hidden beneath a curtain of overhanging ivy, he found what he was looking for. A small depression in the soft earth, and a faint, thin piece of metallic thread snagged on a broken root. Julian had been here. He had stood on the edge and dropped the locket, sealing the proof of his parentage and his mother's crime forever in the earth. The metallic thread must have come from the silk ribbon that wrapped the curl of hair inside the locket. Elias felt a profound wave of pity for the lost, broken man. Julian had performed the only act of freedom left to him, murder, followed by the ritualistic burial of his mother's shame. But had he stopped there? Elias walked around the well one more time, his lawyer's instincts screaming a warning. He was alone, in the darkness, with the proof of 2 murders. And then he saw it. Tucked beneath a heavy, flat capstone a few feet from the well was a tattered black velvet bow, the type Julian was often forced to wear in his hair as a young boy, a detail from the journal entries. Next to it was a patch of recently disturbed soil. Elias grabbed the stone and strained, leveraging it up onto its side. Beneath the capstone, a small, shallow grave had been dug. Not a human grave, but a final repository for the objects Julian believed were the symbols of his bondage. In the shallow, damp earth, Elias found 1. Julian's plain gold band, the ring he wore in the daguerreotype, the symbol of his marriage to his mother's will, was crushed and bent. 2. The masterpiece. Portrait, not the original, but the canvas itself, rolled up and stuffed into the hole. Julian had taken the portrait down after his mother's death, rolled it, and buried it. 3. A pair of rusted garden shears. Lenore's gardening tool, the implement Julian must have used to commit the murder, proving the dark stain was not from a fever. Julian had carefully disposed of every symbol of his servitude. leaving only the ledger and affidavit for the outside world to find, ensuring his mother's true legacy would be revealed. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the forest, loud and close. Elias froze, heart hammering. The sound was too heavy for a deer, too rhythmic for a falling branch. Someone was watching him. Someone had followed his trail. Elias immediately extinguished the lamp, plunging the area into absolute darkness, save for the faint sliver of moon breaking through the clouds. He drew his walking stick, his body tense. A voice, rough and low, spoke from the shadow of the massive oak, right at the wellhead. "The keeper has broken his oath, Mr. Thorne. The silence is gone." It was not the sheriff. It was a younger voice, hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. Julian Ashworth. Julian stepped into the faint moonlight. He was gaunt, his face covered in a week's growth of beard, his eyes large and black in the dim light. He wore the same dark suit he wore in the photograph, but it was now torn and muddy. He was holding something in his hand, something Elias recognized from the description in Julian's final journal entry. A large, heavy stone, sharpened by years of exposure. The perfect weapon for a desperate, broken man. Julian slowly raised the stone, aiming it directly at the lawyer. "You found the truth, Mr. Thorne. Now you must become the final keeper. You must join the silence. The revelation is complete, but the danger is just beginning." Will Elias be silenced by Julian, the broken avenger? Don't miss a single terrifying word. Subscribe to the channel now and make sure you hit that notification bell for the final chilling chapters of the Macabre mansion. Elias Thorne did not move, his lawyer's mind racing to analyze the threat. Julian, though physically frail, held the unshakable certainty of a man who has passed the point of no return. His act of patricide, or matricide in this final iteration, had been his only path to freedom. "Julian, stop," Elias said, his voice quiet, calm, and utterly devoid of fear, the tone a lawyer uses to diffuse a hostile witness. "I have the ledger. I have the affidavit. I know what she did to you and what she did to your father. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to close the chapter that your mother wrote." Julian flinched, the words "mother" and "ledger" striking him like physical blows. He lowered the heavy stone slightly, his eyes still wide, fixed on Elias. "You don't understand," Julian whispered, the sound a dry, rattling hiss. "The silence is the only thing that holds the shame. If the town knows, if the law knows, then I am not the keeper. I am only the monster, the one who finished her masterpiece with blood. You are not the monster, Julian. You are the victim who survived," Elias insisted, taking a small step forward, allowing the faint moonlight to illuminate his own face and his serious intent. "Lenore was the monster. She murdered your father and crippled your life with a fraudulent legal document. I have the proof. I can use this to clear you." "Clear me?" Julian's voice cracked in a manic laugh. "She made me help her. I watched her give the last dose. I was 12. And for 16 years, I lived as the man she stole from the locket. The shame is in my veins. The only way to clean it was to become the ultimate silent avenger. I put her in the ground, but the house still screams her name. You did the only thing a broken man could do," Elias conceded, knowing that validating Julian's pain was the only defense he had. "But you left the key for me. You left the ledger in the repository. You wanted the truth to come out, Julian. You wanted the world to know what she made you do. Why else leave the trail?" Julian's hand holding the stone began to tremble violently. I don't know. The house. It told me to leave the key. It told me to give the final proof to the outside world, to the one man who wouldn't be silenced by her money. But the silence must be maintained. I can't live with the pity. I can't live with the eyes. Elias realized that Julian was not afraid of the law. He was terrified of the gossip, the shame, the public unveiling of the depths of his humiliation. He had been so meticulously conditioned by Lenore to live a silent, dignified lie that the truth, even his freedom, was unbearable. "The shame is hers, Julian, and it ends tonight," Elias declared. He slowly reached into his case and pulled out the legal affidavit that declared Julian incompetent. He held it up to the faint moonlight. "This is the true chain she used. I will use this to break the shame. I will use this to prove that you were never a man, but a prisoner of an insane woman's will. You cannot be judged for this act, Julian." Elias then performed the ultimate theatrical legal act. He ripped the affidavit in half, the sound tearing through the oppressive Ozarks silence. He then ripped it again, shredding the pieces and letting them fall into the black maw of the old stone well. "There, the legal chain is broken. The property is yours, legally, ethically, and morally. You are free, Julian. You own the silence now. You own the house." Julian stared at the white pieces of paper fluttering down into the endless dark. His weapon, the stone, fell from his numb fingers, clattering onto the stones. The realization of his sudden, complete freedom seemed to overwhelm him, a freedom bought at the highest price. Free. Julian breathed, sinking to his knees beside the well. "But I killed my mother. I was the keeper, and I failed the law." "The law of the state may judge your physical act, Julian," Elias said, walking forward and gently placing a hand on Julian's shaking shoulder. "But the law of the heart, the law of necessity frees you. You took the life of a murderer to save your own soul. The Ozarks will cover for you as they covered for her. The sheriff will see this ledger and he will uphold the silence out of self-preservation. They are rid of Lenore. They will be rid of her son, too." He was offering Julian a final dark mercy, the chance to vanish completely, upheld by the community's own complicity and the sheriff's desire for a quiet resolution. "You must disappear, Julian, tonight. Take the last of the money in the safe. Go north, change your name. The estate is legally yours now. I will administer it until you are truly gone, but you can never return to the house." Julian looked up, his eyes meeting Elias's, a flicker of sanity finally returning. "The house. It is the masterpiece. It will always be Lenore. Then let it be her tomb," Elias said. "Let the house keep the silence, and you keep your freedom." Julian slowly nodded, the weight of the last 16 years finally lifting, replaced by the crushing exhaustion of his brief freedom. He rose, turning his back on the well, on the house, and on the terrifying identity of the keeper. He melted into the thick darkness of the forest, heading away from the town, away from the silence, seeking the light of a new, terrifyingly uncertain future. Elias knew he would never see him again. Julian Ashworth was now truly gone, his fate known only to the darkness of the Ozark woods. Elias Thorne stood alone by the well, the silence of the night profound and absolute. Julian was gone, leaving behind the heavy stone and the shallow grave of symbols. Elias gathered the masterpiece portrait, the crushed ring, and the ledger. He knew his final duty. He had to ensure the silence was maintained, not to protect Lenore, but to protect Julian, the only true victim. He made his way back to the mansion, the shadows of the twisted oak tree seeming less menacing now, as if the oppressive soul of Lenore Ashworth had finally been exorcised. Back in the master suite, Elias sat at the ornate writing desk, the lamplight casting deep shadows. He opened the ledger once more, preparing to make his final official entry as the executor of the estate, now technically Julian's. His hand paused over the leather cover. He noticed something he had missed before. The back lining of the ledger, a double layer of stiff paper. He ran a knife along the edge and peeled it back, revealing a final single sheet of paper tucked between the cover and the binding. It was Julian's true final entry, written days before the murder, a detailed account of his complete, final psychological breakdown. August 20th, 1894. I am dying, not of fever, but of the silence. She has locked me in this room again, punishing me for my small request to sell the old carriage. She claims I am too weak to make decisions, too fragile to live without her. But the fragility is hers. She is growing weaker. The fever is not a tonic, it is a poison from her own fear. I have found the final proof of the poison she used on Father, hidden in her small shed. A crystalline powder that burns the lungs. She is dying, but she will not let me live. She told me today that she is having the portrait reframed, the lonely one. She said the other one, the one where I stand in Thomas's place, was a mistake of vanity. She is erasing me, too. I am not the keeper, or the husband, or the son. I am nothing. She will die, and then I will be left here, a grown man with no history, no name, and no future. I can't exist in her silence, but she made me promise. She made me swear on the locket that I would keep the house sealed until the day I die. She said I must protect the silence of the Ozarks. She said if I break the silence, I break my soul. The entry stopped, but beneath it, a final trembling scrawl was added. The truth is not in the locket. The truth is in the house. She said Thomas's coffin was sealed with an extra layer of pitch and stone to protect him from the river damp. But she made me carry the poison bottle in the coffin. She said it was the final, safe repository of the family shame. She sealed the truth with his body. Elias recoiled. The horror was now subterranean. Thomas Ashworth's coffin, buried in the private cemetery behind the mansion, contained not just his body, but the physical evidence of his murder, the bottle of poison. Julian, a boy of 12, had been forced to carry the evidence to his father's grave. Julian's final act had been about cleansing the shame, not just by killing his mother, but by making sure the evidence of the first murder, which had bound him, was finally gone. Elias had to check the cemetery. He owed Thomas Ashworth, Julian, and the truth of the house. He went out into the night and walked the short, dark path to the small, overgrown family plot. The monuments were heavy granite. Thomas Ashworth's was the largest, a massive stone sarcophagus that was indeed secured with heavy iron straps, sealed against the elements. Near the base of the sarcophagus, Elias saw a small, freshly dug patch of earth. Elias retrieved a shovel from the garden shed and began to dig where the earth had been disturbed. After several minutes of back-breaking work, the shovel struck wood. He cleared the dirt and saw a small, square wooden box. Julian had been here. He hadn't been digging up the entire coffin, only the spot at the base. Elias pried the small box open. Inside, covered in damp earth, was a single dark glass vial, corked and still containing a small amount of crystalline residue. It was the poison, the ultimate physical proof of Lenore's crime, which Julian had been forced to protect for 16 years, had finally been exhumed. Julian hadn't thrown the poison into the well to destroy it. He had left it for Elias, sealing it in a final, tangible piece of evidence. Julian had broken his promise to his mother in the most complete way possible, by revealing the entire chain of violence and control. Elias took the vial and the final journal entry. He had the proof. He had the truth. The story of Lenore Ashworth's masterpiece and Julian's Avenger's silence was now complete. The sun was rising over the Ozarks, casting long, fractured shadows across the property. The humidity had broken, replaced by a cool, clear air that felt like a final cleansing breath. Elias Thorne stood in the drawing room of the Macabre mansion, his task complete. He had the evidence, Lenore's ledger, the affidavit of incompetence, now shredded, Julian's final journal entry, and the vial of poison. He had the narrative, the murder of Thomas, the psychological entrapment of Julian, and Julian's final necessary act of vengeance and escape. Elias walked to the sheriff's office. Peterson was startled to see him so early, covered in dirt and exhaustion. But his initial suspicion gave way to a cold dread when Elias laid the evidence on the desk. Elias spoke clearly, detailing the murder, the legal fraud, the psychological torment, and Julian's ultimate fate. He omitted only the method of Lenore's death, suggesting the poison had a delayed effect, or that Julian had found her dead and simply vanished. Lenore Ashworth murdered her husband, Sheriff, Elias concluded, tapping the vial. She used the law to enslave her son. Julian Ashworth is a victim of abuse and a legally declared incompetent. He has fled this valley, never to return. You have the choice, Sheriff. Pursue a broken, innocent man and reveal the depths of Lenore's depravity, or seal the truth of this house forever. Sheriff Peterson stared at the evidence. The poison, the ledger detailing the murder, the sketch of the altered portrait, and then out the window toward the vast, silent woods. He looked like a man whose entire worldview had been shattered, and whose long-held economic security was now revealed as a pact with the devil. "The town is rid of her, Mr. Thorne," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "The Ozarks prefer a quiet ending. We will maintain the silence. Lenore Ashworth died of heart failure. Julian Ashworth never returned after her burial. The house will be sealed, and the estate liquidated in his absence." Elias secured the ledger and the vial. He knew the sheriff would keep his word. The economic and social stability of Black Creek depended on it. Back at the mansion, Elias completed his final duty. He paid Martha a significant severance, instructing her to leave the county and never speak of the matter. He then went through the house one last time, sealing the master suite, Julian's room, and the repository. He returned to the main hall, looking up at the solitary portrait of Lenore, the symbol of her ultimate possessive victory. Elias took a ladder and climbed up to the portrait. He removed the lonely, arrogant image of Lenore. Behind it, he found the wall was damp and stained. He left the space empty. The house would now forever carry the mark of what was missing. Elias left the mansion and secured the front door with a heavy chain and padlock. He didn't look back. The Ashworth estate, the Macabre mansion, was now a sealed tomb, a monument to the terrifying depths of human control and the price of a broken man's freedom. Julian Ashworth was gone, a phantom of the Ozarks, free from the house and the name. Elias Thorne, the pragmatic lawyer, left the valley the next morning carrying with him the horrific burden of proof, the ultimate terrifying realization that the most frightening horrors are not found in the supernatural, but in the cold human heart. The silence of the mansion was finally complete. The masterpiece was sealed,